We have to talk about this Doc Rivers situation because this is a potential disaster for Milwaukee. So you guys all know Doc Rivers shows up to the Bucks in the middle of the season. They fire Adrian Griffin. He now becomes the head coach and he gets off to a rocky start. And since we talked about it last, it has only gotten worse. They went into the All-Star break like 3-7 in their last 10 games. Just not a very good Bucks team at all. Yes, Chris Middleton has missed some time. Yes, they're still trying to figure out a lot of the pieces of their roster, trying to make moves at the deadline. It's a difficult time to just show up and be a head coach in the middle of the season. But that's honestly not even the biggest part of this, because now all of a sudden over All-Star weekend, we had this huge discourse, not only about Doc Rivers in Milwaukee, but about what kind of coach he is in general, even going so far as to have guys like JJ Redick go and call out Doc Rivers and talk about a lack of accountability for him and talk about how he didn't like him as a coach. And then we've got, Pat Bev, who's on the Bucks right now, defending Doc Rivers and calling out JJ Redick. And then we've got Austin Rivers, the son, of Doc Rivers, of course, defending his dad. Then we've got former Clippers players coming out and saying, yeah, he wasn't that great of a coach. And all of this stems from comments that Doc has made talking about how he didn't understand why Milwaukee was making a coaching change in the middle of the year. He wanted the job, but he didn't really get it, and just kind of always pushing off blame onto other people, kind of leading to the comments that JJ Redick was talking about with a lack of accountability, where there is always an excuse. There is always a reason, it seems like, why things haven't worked out for Doc for one reason or another. In Philadelphia, you go back to the Ben Simmons situation and him wanting out, and then of course Harden and all these other things. There's all this stuff that you can connect to the reasons why Doc Rivers hasn't been as successful, especially in the postseason since winning a title with Boston. And it all comes back to this idea of like, why did Milwaukee do this in the first place? Why did they bring in Doc Rivers in the middle of the year? Now, here's the thing. If you're a head coach and you're showing up in the middle of the season, whether that be on an interim basis because the old guy got fired, or in this very, very strange, almost never happens kind of situation where you're being brought in from outside of the team to replace someone in the middle of the year, that's always going to be difficult. Guys are used to the old head coach. Even if they wanted the old coach gone, there's still, principles and tactics and relationship building that has to go on that is supposed to happen over multiple seasons, and certainly during the offseason if you're a new coach. And this is never supposed to be easy. It's a valid excuse for Doc Rivers to say, this was more difficult than I thought it was going to be, and I didn't understand why they were bringing in me in the middle of the year and firing their old coach. Granted, okay, in that case, just don't take the job, but still, it's a valid excuse. Having said that, a team as talented as Milwaukee, even with the roster issues that we have talked about in other videos, a team that has Giannis and has Dame and when healthy has Chris Middleton, should not be as bad as they were going into the All-Star break. They should be winning more games than they are. We can talk about whether they are contenders or not, but strictly from a talent perspective, if you have Giannis on your team, there's no way that you should be this bad. And it opens up the possibility of two things. One, that Doc Rivers might not be the Bucks coach even next year if the season continues to go this poorly. And two, that Milwaukee has made a massive, irredeemable mistake that's going to have huge consequences down the road for their franchise. Now, first and foremost, I'm starting to think that it is possible, given how poorly this has gone, just bad vibes around Milwaukee, that Doc Rivers is not the head coach next season. And that might seem crazy because they went out of their way to bring this guy in the middle of the year, but they didn't go out of their way to bring him in the offseason. Doc Rivers was available as a head coach and they didn't hire him then. We're going to talk about some of that stuff a little bit later. But this almost felt like, okay, we don't want Adrian Griffin as the head coach anymore. This isn't working. And Doc Rivers was the best guy available. But if Milwaukee loses in the first round or something, I wouldn't be shocked if once again Milwaukee is looking for a new coach. I know that they signed him to a contract and this and that, but clearly this is a team that feels a sense of urgency to get the head coaching position correct. And if they got this wrong and they end up firing Doc in the offseason, or it just continues to not go well even if they bring him back, this kind of mismanagement is a gigantic red flag to stars like Giannis. And obviously Giannis has been incredibly loyal to Milwaukee. He's also had a good amount of influence over some of the decision-making processes there. And to this point, we have no indication that Giannis wants to leave, that he wants to go elsewhere. The franchise has continued to add more and more pieces through the Drew Holiday trade, the Damian Lillard trade, to try and continue to be a contending team. And that's what Giannis has said in the past. If they're trying to win, he's trying to be there. However, one thing that we have definitely learned throughout the history of the league is that stars want to be on and playing for a functional organization. They want to be with a team that is doing the correct things, and obviously that they have an input on, but you want to get an idea that they know what they're doing. And how they've handled the entirety of this coaching situation could be seen as a bit of a red flag for Giannis. So Coach Bud was there. They were successful with Coach Bud. They end up firing him. I would be surprised if that was something that Giannis wanted. It seemed like he was loyal to Coach Bud. He was loyal to Jason Kidd before that as well. And then they bring in Adrian Griffin, and clearly that wasn't the correct choice. And then they do the Doc Rivers thing in the middle of the year. And if you start to look like an organization that doesn't know what they're doing, for stars like Giannis, that is a huge, huge issue. issue, which brings me back to kind of the core point of all of this, because right now, a lot of the blame in Milwaukee is being pointed towards Doc Rivers for not doing a good job, showing up in the middle of the year, and or making excuses. But why can't we talk about the decision makers in Milwaukee, the guys that made the choice to, one, bring in Adrian Griffin when they had a very high profile, very sought after head coaching job? I assumed they were going to get someone like Nick Nurse. They went with Adrian Griffin, who, by the way, could still be a very, very good coach in a certain situation. He had an incredible record with Milwaukee at the time that he was fired, and just things didn't work out there. He could still be a good head coach, but the fact that you fired him in the middle of the year in his first season shows that from a decision-making perspective, those guys didn't make the right choice. And then, of course, they make the choice to bring in Doc Rivers as well. And those are the people that ultimately, if this domino effect eventually leads to Giannis wanting to play for another franchise, whether it be in free agency or a trade, that is going to fall on the shoulders of the decision makers in Milwaukee that decided to screw up this head coaching situation in the first place. And we're not particularly close to that outcome of Giannis wanting out, wanting to go elsewhere. But if there was a way for them to start to try and make that happen through the head coaching situation, what they have done this year with that spot is exactly how you would do it if you wanted to ultimately drive Giannis away. And the reason that all of this matters is because the only thing that matters to the Milwaukee Bucks franchise is retaining Giannis. Him being happy, being there, and building a contender around him. That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter whose feelings you hurt in terms of the head coaching situation. It doesn't matter what players you do or don't trade away. If the end result is Giannis is there and you are a contender, that's all that matters. Because the moment that he leaves, regardless of what you get in a potential trade, regardless of what happens in free agency, you get cap space, whatever the case may be, it is an absolute disaster if at any point Giannis is no longer a Milwaukee Buck. This is someone that you cannot replace. It is impossible for you to replace him in general, but certainly from a star power perspective, Milwaukee is not a market that is going to be able to bring in stars like this. You hit the lottery by drafting this guy in the middle of the first round and him developing into an MVP candidate, and that is the only way that you will ever get an MVP caliber player in Milwaukee. And so him possibly leaving is the only thing that you should be focused on, and you should be focused on building a contender through both the head coach as well as the roster. Now, clearly, they have attempted to do that with Dame and all these other things, but I don't think in this exact moment they are in the top tier of contenders. We just talked about this in a video the other day. There are a handful of teams right now, not only within the Eastern Conference, but within the league as well, that I would pick over Milwaukee to potentially make the finals and win the title this year, and that is not a good situation to be in if you're the Bucks, because their entire season is going to be judged on how well they do in the postseason. If they lose in the first round, if they don't make the conference finals, things get very, very weird in Milwaukee very quickly. Now, all of this sounds very dramatic in the moment, but they very easily are talented enough to figure it out. Doc has at least shown a lot of experience as a head coach, which is something that Adrian Griffin did not offer. It's still a very talented team once they get healthy, all these other things. They can certainly make the conference finals, make the finals, and none of this will matter, right? But in this exact moment, it's important to point towards not just Doc, not just the excuses, but the decision makers in Milwaukee and the possibility that the decisions that they have made could lead to Giannis no longer being a Milwaukee Buck.